Hello, everyone. We're live just a couple of seconds early. Welcome to night 2 of the New York Ghost Story Festival. Before we do our introductions and say hello to everyone who's with us, we'll play our opening video for you. Welcome, everyone, to night 2 of the New York Ghost Story Festival 2021. This is our second year. Welcome to all guests. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Daniel Braum. I'm the author of Underworld Dreams. I'm here with Kathe Koja, Brian Evenson, and Rudy Dornerman. Jeff Ford could not make it tonight. He had a conflict that came up at the last minute, so he sends his ghostly regards to everyone. Jeff will be our resident ghost tonight, but at risk of a very, very bad pun, I think he's still going to be here in spirit. We're certainly going to be talking about his stories, and his ideas are never far away. So sending all our best to Jeff. I'm going to introduce our guests and get to the discussion in just a second. First, I'll introduce the festival. The New York Ghost Story Festival is an annual event of ghost story readings and discussion that was founded last year with the intent of bringing together authors of the uncanny, strange, and fantastic from New York and around the country and around the world to celebrate and examine the ghost story in all its forms. You're watching on the YouTube channel Daniel Braum. Please subscribe if you'd like to stay in touch with the full festival. This year, the event is 5 nights. The next night is this Tuesday, December 14th. And then we have Friday, December 17th. And Saturday, December 18th. And so you can come back and watch this night, or you can watch any of the nights at any time on the YouTube channel. A notion that came up, I think Jeff, he either said this or he certainly was talking about it. It was a notion that you don't have to have a ghost to have a haunting. And that just a really cool umbrella of, I love all the ghost stories, but there are so many different kinds, and the ones that operate that way just really get excited. But on to tonight's guests. We're going to be opening the discussion with a question to the entire panel, and in between, I'm going to talk to everyone in turn. Our first guest tonight is Kathe Koja, an award-winning writer of short fiction and novels, including The Cipher, Velocities, Under the Poppy, and the forthcoming Dark Factory. And she directs and produces immersive events. She's based in Detroit and thinks globally. Her website is kathekoja.com, and she's Kathe Koja on Twitter, that's with an E, and on Facebook. Dark Factory is her new immersive fiction project you can find at darkfactory.club. And this one was written to be read online and on the page, with a print edition coming May 2020 from Meerkat Press. Kathe, welcome back to the series, to Nighttime Logic. It was a blast having you in the summer reading series, and it's really great to talk ghost stories with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I love to reclaim the sweetness of the Christmas holiday season and leaven it with a little of the supernatural.
You've got the silver decorations and The F for fun is right behind your head.
I know, right? Or the on, right? You can't spell fun without FU.
On.
So
She's moved her head.
I'm trying to like move.
fun.
There we go. There we go. There we go. Fun. Yes, that was from one of.
No applause. Just have fun when you see the sign. That is
Right, right. It's the fun sign.
Speaking of fun, I want to welcome back to the festival Brian Evenson. Brian is the author of over a dozen books of fiction. Most recently, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which came out this year. His collection, Song for the Unraveling of the World, the 2019 release, won the Shirley Jackson Award and the World Fantasy Award and was a finalist for the Ray Bradbury Prize. He has received an NEA Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and his work has been translated into more than a dozen languages. He lives in Los Angeles and teaches at Cal Arts. It's great to have you back this year too, Brian. You're on mute, so do I have you muted?
I've already started that. Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's my superpower is to the wonderful powers of a host. My powers are to mispronounce things and keep people on mute when I'm talking to them. So everyone's like, Dan, do that. So that was one of the fun things we were talking about, as opposed to weather and extraneous sounds that make it onto camera and readings. The true glimpse as to what we talk about backstage. You have it right there. Welcoming back to the festival as well, Rudy Dornerman. Rudy Dornerman grew up in Milwaukee and now lives in frequently fog-shrouded Maine. His writing has appeared in places like Conduit, Strange Horizons, the Mummy anthology Spirits Unwrapped, and the forthcoming folk horror anthology Dark Heart of the Woods, which is coming from Oxygen Press. He instigated and contributed to the flash fiction website called The Daily Cabal, and just had a new flash piece appear in the online magazine Pareidolia Literary. His latest project is a fiction podcast email series called Notes from an Imaginary Place, which can be found and subscribed to at his website, which is rudydornerman.com. It's great to see you again, Rudy, and great to have you here.
Hi, yeah, thanks for including me in, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to Ghost Story season, I guess. It's good to be here.
It is Ghost Story season, and something, again, we were all talking about. All of us here, we love the Ghost Story, and we love M.R. James. We're probably going to hear some M.R. James tonight, and we love all the British ghosts. We're American writers. We love the American ghosts, but one of the things I wanted to make sure that we talked about this festival are the ghosts, the non-UK ghosts, the non things that we hear about, even though we associate them or used to associate them at Christmas time. So I'm just going to throw a general question out to the panel. Anyone jump in? What are some of the standout ghost stories from around the world, or what is it that we like about? What are some of the things that stand out to us about the non English-centric ghost story? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll take a stab.
Right.
I think it's so important for readers and writers, especially, to continue to broaden where we center our attention and what can scare us and what can enlarge the space where we're scared, where we're put off, where we're disturbed, where our footing is lost. And especially from a Western perspective, which sometimes can be very, self-centered, being put off your feet in the very best way by reading fiction from a culture not your own. There's a Lafcadio Hearn book, which has some just fucking badass illustrations.
Ooh, which one is that? I've got my quiet on.
Yes, same, but different edition. And some of the stories in here are so great because the payoff is 100% different than you would expect in a Western milieu. The scares are different. The burden of proof is different. Everything is different, and that's fantastic for a reader and a writer to find yourself on new ground.
Yeah, Brian, you unmuted. Did you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I can jump in too. I mean, I completely agree with that, and I just have been reading Hearn as well, weirdly enough, and love him. And part of the reason I love him is because I don't always know where it's going to go or where it's going to take me to. I teach a horror fiction and film class at Cal Arts where I am, and one thing that I always like to do is teach Japanese horror films, because there's just such a different notion of the supernatural and the degree to which it is or isn't part of actual life, as opposed to American,
Right.
American kind of films. And so I often think of it. I think it's The Grudge, the American version.
Yeah.
There's a moment when they tell the sheriff there's a ghost, and the sheriff is like, no, there's no such things as ghosts. I don't believe in that. And then of course gets killed. And in the Japanese version of the same film, they tell him, the detective, and he says, "I see," and then they just kind of go on. It's just like
Yeah.
and so
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I do agree. It's like we do get really blinkered sometimes in terms of our Western ideas of things, and so much about the way in which the supernatural and ghosts are dealt with in other countries just can really open us up to really interesting ways of thinking.
And avoid just some of the crap that comes. Now we're talking about film. I think so much time is wasted in American film about, something's with a ghost, and then you have to spend 30 minutes of airtime. Do they believe or not? Is it real or not? Well, is it real or not? I'm okay with. But that whole trope of I'm the only one who believes is just so boring. It's so boring at this point.
Yeah.
I've seen the big Japanese horror films. I haven't seen that many Japanese horror films, but the Japanese films that I have seen are the 90s era Godzilla movies. And why that's worth noting is the stakes and the conflicts are so much different in those films. And as I imagine they are, picking up on what Kathe said about how it's just different and it's broadened. Like in America, we just have the notion of the rugged hero, the individualist, stepping in, and the rebel saving the day. Whereas in other cultures, in Japan, that is not the thing that is heroic is the most opposite. And one of my favorite Japanese Godzilla films, it's about the guy who's the janitor or the mechanic of the Godzilla Defense Force, and the Mecha Godzilla unit is haunted. And like this guy, the whole plot seems to be about this one guy dealing with that ghost, ultimately sacrificing himself for the good of the nation. And it's kind of humorous to talk about like a Godzilla film or a haunted Mecha Godzilla, but I think it just really starkly illustrates to me how if ghost stories are really about us, and each culture's ghost stories are really, we could watch them and really broaden our horizon. Rudy, what are some non-US ghost stories that catch your attention and are on your radar?
Let's see. Yeah, I've read some Japanese stuff, a little bit here and there, kind of like this summer I read some I forget how to pronounce his first name, but Akutagawa, like Hell Screen, and some stuff that's just, you figure there are some universals like death, but everything around death can be really different from culture to culture. And so, like people were saying, you don't necessarily know where the story is going to take you, and that's really interesting. And then lately, I've been reading a lot of these sort of classic Chinese ghost stories, and there too, there's just a real variety of them, and lots of things you wouldn't expect. Like in one story, there's a man who falls in love with a woman who's a ghost, and she's dying, and she's afraid she's going to turn into this like second generation ghost, and so there's a whole thing with that. It's just it just goes in directions you wouldn't have you didn't have the mythological mechanics necessarily. So it definitely helps to kind of expand your thinking to kind of
We're
get
going to
out of
talk
the usual.
just a bit about some of those Chinese stories, but just staying with the panel for one more follow-up question. I think everyone's mentioned expectations and how at least to us, the foreign ghost story is new to our expectations. So it got me thinking, how important are both sides of that coin? Like, how important is it to have a ghost story meet certain expectations and play to your expectations, and how important is it for our stories to defy them? And I love both, right? There's something comforting about a good old classic story that goes down right on the pipes, but yet there's also something totally exciting about something new that we didn't expect. How does the panel feel about that?
I'll talk just a little bit about that. My mom is a big mystery reader, and if she can guess the mystery, within the first like 2/3 of the book, that's really frustrating for her. She doesn't like that. If she can't guess it till like the last 4 or 5 pages, or can't guess it at all, that's also really frustrating for her. And there is something about feeling like she can understand the codes of the book and make sense of them, but also that combination of surprise and fulfillment of expectation, I think is something that we get in ghost stories as well. We want the kinds of scares that we get from ghost stories, but we don't want to have them in exactly the same way we had them before. Partly because I think it's like a drug, and once you have it too many times, you need something else. Exactly, wears off.
But then we have M.R. James. Kathe, you mentioned M.R. James backstage as well, and then M.R. James and Kelly Link, their stories just don't behave, and their ghosts just aren't on those expectations.
And I think part of what makes fear pleasurable or bearable is that feeling of, I know there are going to be limits in this, and that's why stories from other cultures or stories that don't go, like M.R. James, don't go where you expect, is 100 times worse. It's 100 times more frightening, because you realize the laws that I thought applied here don't apply anymore. It's like someone just repealed the law of gravity in a certain room, and you're like, wait, what? If I go in there, there's no gravity. Well, what is there? Well, I don't know. Why don't you go in? And it depends how. Well, that's one thing that I hate about a lot of. Well, hate is a strong word. One of the things that I don't care about them enough to hate them, but some, especially horror or supernatural films, that always do what you expect them to do, and there's like the scare, the resolution, the scare. It's like, you know what? I don't need to be that safe. That's why I'm here. Okay,
Yeah.
I would like you to give me something while I'm here, and a surprise is necessary.
Well, hey, look, people love what they love, and that's right. So there's a certain joy and a certain market where people love going in for that standard or for that jump scare. For my money, I probably mentioned this last year. I can't stop mentioning it. But one of the movies, I love movies that have like the sort of the garden path. Movies or stories that look like they're going to be the trope, but then they turn on it before you know it. Like what you were saying, Kathe. Suddenly you're like, who turned off the gravity? And I think a movie that does that fantastically is the movie It Follows. It's a movie that looks like it's going to be your standard teen jump scare with all the things, and every opportunity there is for it to be a standard trope, it pulls the rug out, and then before you know it, you're like, this looks like a movie. It's shaped like the movie I know, but I don't know what's going to happen. And if the movie or a story does its job right, which I think that one does, we're feeling so many range of emotions for those people.
There's we talked, I don't know if we talked about it yesterday in Soundcheck or what. There's a recent film, and I am blocking on all details of it, unfortunately. I don't remember the director's name. The main characters are a couple who are refugeeing from a country in Africa, and they come to the UK, and they're treated perfunctorily at best by the Refugee Association, but it's a ghost story, and it has very much to do with their refugeeing, and that too goes nowhere that I expected, and I thought it was brilliant. And if I was
I think
better, I
I'm
would
not getting
remember the name.
I think you told me the name, and it shares the name with Brian's story.
His house. His house.
Oh, his house. Oh, Brian's is his. Brian, yours is his hauntings. That's what
Right.
for a second I was like, is that a Brian Evenson thing?
No.
Does anyone know this movie? Have you
Yeah,
guys?
I've seen it. It's really good. I agree. I mean, it does. I mean, I think that's it. Is it kind of has the structure of a ghost story, but also does things that you just don't expect. So it's the combination of the two really work.
Yes. Yes. And because you're waiting for it to pay off in a particular way, there's one moment, and this doesn't spoil anything for anyone, but where one of the members of the couple asks for help in a situation from some people she thinks she can expect at least some fellow feeling from, and they just shut her down as if she's a non-person. And that's not what you'd expect. That's a whole nother level of saying you're isolated, you're on your own. Even people you thought might help you in this new country that you're not super geeked about being here anyway, even they don't want anything to do with you. So,
Yeah.
sister, you are on your own.
Hmm.
It's really good. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm definitely adding that one.
The other thing I'd say is, like, the reason Kelly Link is so successful is because she knows so much about the tropes of ghost stories that came before, and knows how to use them and how not to use them and how to use them in a different way. So it's partly that she's so steeped in the tradition of ghost stories that just makes her deviations from those the standard paths as successful as they are.
Yeah, that's just one of the many masterful things about Kelly Link, and we're all writers here. I mean, we all have different approaches, but you know, it's amazing to think about Kelly's process. How when she writes a story, you use the word steeped, and you're not kidding. I've heard her speak, and she said, okay, when she's writing a story about this topic, okay, ghost stories, she wants to, if not read, know about all the ghost stories, and really really be immersed in them. And she spoke about writing to what she perceives as the wholes. Okay, there's never been a ghost story about this, there's never been an alien story about that. And yeah, there are all different approaches. That is just one there. I think if we have some time at the end, I'd love to come back and talk a bit more about film as well, but I want to move on to our first set of questions, which is going to be to Rudy. And we'll go back to some of these non-USA, non-UK ghosts. So you mentioned, Rudy, that you've been making your way through a book by Pu Song-ling, and is that one called Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio? Is that the book?
That would be the book.
Oh.
Yep.
Ah,
yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
You've got it there.
Yeah, I've been working through the Penguin Classics edition, but there's a number of people who've done them. I mean, I guess there's between 400 and 500 tales total, so not everybody's tackled translating all of them. But yeah, they're just a whole range of different strange things. A lot of ghost stories, a lot of fox spirit stories, and a mix of things that are kind of what to us are following more of a sort of polished story-like thing versus short anecdotes that are almost like an urban legend feel. Like, here's just this strange thing that I heard somebody saw. And a lot of times he's tied it in. It's like, yeah, my friend's cousins told me that, he saw this ogre one day come out of his wall and or little people come out of the wainscoting and this is how he drove them away.
Do you think that comes from the oral tradition that maybe they started from?
Maybe. From doing some extra reading on Pu Song-ling, it sounds like he was kind of following the Kelly Link approach of, really studying everything that was out there. And I mean, since I'm not that familiar with other Chinese ghost stories, I don't necessarily realize where he's kind of adding an extra spin or, pulling together a bunch of different strands. But apparently that's part of why this book has kind of endured, is that he was at a point where ghost stories were getting popular and they were starting to feel a little stale, and he kind of breathed another bit of life into it. So
I'm curious. I know, like, because in we're going to be talking with Kathe about one of her stories that I was just revisiting. Her story Velocity is also, well, it's not it differs from the standard narration, and we talked about expectations, and I'm just wondering, if stories could it be just like, yeah, that's how we tell a story. It's like, right, if I saw an ogre, I wouldn't see no, but if I saw something that troubled me or was supernatural, okay, maybe I might just forget it, or maybe I would come to you, Rudy, and be, oh yeah, Rudy, yeah, when we were at the convention, I thought I could have sworn I saw Brian at the elevator, but then he was up on the roof, right at the it's just like, I swear it was Brian's doppelganger. It was Brian's, that's a joke, but like, right, isn't that the way these ghost stories develop versus, taking someone who is doing something innovative like Kelly Link or Kathe's story? She's like, okay, I don't have to just tell beginning, middle, and end. I can use an interview format, or I can use put the present scene and break it up. So you're finding a lot of that in the Strange Tales from Chinese studio, those formats.
yeah, there's a there's a bit of tying things back, framing them. Sometimes there'd be, there's actually the one right after the one I was thinking of reading is like almost a ghost or zombie story. And at the end, there's very definitely a little bit of time spent on, and the ghost's fingers had dug into the trunk, and they found, the grooves where that was, and sort of that proof element coming out at the end. Kind of be like,
is that one called? Is that an otherworldly encounter that you're thinking of reading from?
No, actually, it was the one. When I was going back over the otherworldly encounter, I wound up getting distracted and reading the next one, and rereading the next one too, which is a much more straightforward, creepy ghost story. The thing I like about an otherworldly encounter is that it's very low key in some ways and sneaky in its approach to ghosts, but it feels like it's really close to Pu Songling's world and the things he was concerned with, as somebody who was a scholar who'd passed like the first round of examinations, but not the level he needed to do to get the cushy government job that you tried to get as a scholar in China, and instead had to kind of scrape by being a tutor to rich families, and it gave him a lot of time for his scholarship. And in fact, I saw in one of the footnotes in here that once the book eventually got published and popular, there were stories around that the ghosts and fox spirits had been conspiring, and that they're the ones who blocked him from ever getting his further degrees and getting a respectable position, because no one would be there to tell their stories otherwise. So
I can't wait. I have to hear a ghost story. Which one are you going to read for us?
This will be an otherworldly examination. So.
Okay. Okay. An otherworldly examination. Let's hear Rudy read it for us.
Okay. Song Tao was the grandfather of my elder sister's husband. He was a first-degree graduate and holder of an annual government stipend. One day, he was lying ill in bed when he saw a messenger arrive at his door, bearing an official-looking document and leading a horse with white markings on its forehead. You are hereby summoned to the examination for the second degree. But the examiner for the second degree has not arrived in town yet. They cannot be holding the examination. The messenger made no reply, but urged him to be on his way. So Song struggled out of bed, climbed onto the horse, and was carried away down an unfamiliar road, which soon led to the outskirts of a city grand enough to be a royal capital. Presently, they passed into the imposing buildings of a prefect's official residence, and then into a large hall where, sitting up ahead, Song beheld a group of high-ranking mandarins, none of whom he could identify, with the exception of Guan Yu, the god of war. At the near end of the hall, beneath the eaves, stood a pair of low tables and round stools, and at one of these sat another man, evidently a first-degree graduate like himself. Song sat down at the other table, where brush and paper had been laid ready, and presently A strip of paper with the title of a formal essay topic came fluttering down from the blue and alighted in front of him. Song read the wording of the question. 1 man, 2 men. With intent, without intent. The 2 candidates proceeded to write their essays and, when they were completed, handed them in at the dais. Song's essay read in part, "Virtue performed with intent deserves no reward. Evil committed without intent merits no punishment." The pantheon of examiners passed his script along, and all of them praised it highly. Presently, they called Song up to the dais and delivered the following judgment. There is a city god vacancy in Henan province. You are the preferred candidate for the position. The truth suddenly dawned on Song. He kowtowed to the examiners, weeping and saying, "How could I ever presume to decline such a great honor? But my aged mother is in her 70s and will have no one left to look after her. I beg to be allowed to nurse her until the end of her allotted span of life, when I will gladly take up the post." One of the examiners, who appeared to be the presiding deity, gave orders to check the mother's longevity. And an attendant with a long beard brought out the registers and began leafing through them. "The lady in question has 9 years left on the Yang plane," he reported. The committee of deities was still debating the issue when the god of war made a proposal. "Why do we not appoint the other candidate, Mr. Zhang, to the post in an acting capacity for a period of 9 years, after which candidate Song can take up his plenary appointment?" This being agreed upon, he informed Song of the committee's decision in the following terms. "In the normal course of events, you should proceed straight to this post. In view, however, of your laudable feelings of benevolence and filial piety, we are approving a sabbatical leave of 9 years. When that time has expired, you will be summoned again before us." He ended by giving the other candidate a few well-chosen words of advice, whereupon both men bowed and withdrew from the hall. Zhang took Song companionably by the hand and accompanied him to the outskirts of the town, where he explained that he was from the town of Changshan, and presented Song with a poem of farewell, the words of which have been lost except for a couplet. "With wine and flowers the spring is ever present. With neither candle nor lamp the night is still bright." Song mounted his horse and went on his way. When he reached his village, he awoke as if from a dream to discover that he had been lying dead 3 whole days. His mother heard a groan emanating from within his coffin and immediately gave orders for her son's body to be lifted out of it. Half a day later, he had recovered sufficiently to be able to speak, and when he made inquiries in nearby Changshan, he learned that a Mr. Zhang of that town had indeed breathed his last on the very same day as himself. 9 years later, Song's mother passed away as had been foretold. When her funeral rites were concluded, her son performed his ablutions, retired to his chamber, lay down, and died. His wife's parents lived within the west gate of the town, and at the moment of his death they saw him approaching that house, escorted by a large retinue and riding a richly caparisoned horse. He came walking into their main hall, made them a formal bow of farewell, and went on his way. Not realizing that he was a departed spirit, they rushed out in great perplexity to inquire what all this could mean, only to be informed that their son-in-law had just died. Song wrote a short account of his experiences, but alas, it was lost. I have given the gist of it.
And thankfully so. Thankfully so. Cheers to that reading, and cheers to the recovery of lost ghost stories. Speaking of ghost stories, your most recent project is called Tales from Imaginary Places, and I've read a couple of them already, and we were talking about some of them as we were preparing for this. As at least I was saying, some of the stories, while not having a ghost in them, they felt like what Steve Tem from Night One of the festival was talking about or relaying, that they still felt like haunted tales. And I guess that's why I mentioned in the beginning of tonight, I said you don't have to have a ghost to have a ghost story. And you'll help me remember the name of this tale. This is the one in one of the stories, and these are all secondary worlds, but they feel so real. There was a craftsman who worked on these little statues or little mechanisms that the culture that Rudy was writing about were on each house. What was the name of that story?
That one was Bungalows.
Bungalows. So Rudy, he writes about these imaginary places, and it's this bungalow colony where the cultural tradition is just to have a very unique mechanized ornament on your door. And that story just felt so haunted. Just the way you delivered the craftsman's in a very short space of how his relation to providing these to these families and his own arc was. While there's no ghosts in that is a haunted story. So I asked you if you so I think we called those ghost adjacent. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm full of non-literary terms here. Ghost adjacent, but you have some that might be ghost present or ghost proper in Tales from Imaginary Places.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple. With all of them, I've been kind of starting from this place and inventing it, and as kind of a prompt for myself, I like made a list of 26 alphabetically different places, and bungalow was B. So in each of them, I'm dropping the character in, and I'm finding that with some of them where the places have some history, they're really, if it isn't, I don't know, their relationship to the place becomes something like about their relationship to that history too. And that I think is in a few of them making it feel a bit haunted because there's, I don't know, just the atmosphere begins to build up or the some of the current tensions seem to weave into the relationship to what's happened there before, who's lived there before.
I really love the way you did that. I think you're going to be reading from Underpass tonight.
Yeah, this is one that I don't know. I think maybe I'll put in the January edition. I'm doing one a month. So, but yeah, I think this one, I think it's a ghost story. So, and certainly I think it has that history.
I'm intrigued. I can't wait to hear it. Let's turn it over again to Rudy Dornerman reading from Underpass.
Okay. Old roads run all over this part of the country, mostly hidden under blown sand, buried by decades of spring mudslides, or simply crumbled by time and heat. Not enough visible to form any pattern, to make clear where they once ran from or to. Not enough to reveal a map of the world that built them. Nothing but a quarter mile here, a curve there, a broken off stub jutting from the top of a hill, ovals of cracked blacktop that vary as the weather clears different stretches season to season. The receptionist handles voices. Her days are call and response with people she'll never see, voices speaking deep inside her ears. A couple minutes conversation tells her enough that she knows the connection she needs to make. She makes motions with her hands to open and close connections, to sort among the network's many, many whisper threads. But those motions aren't movement enough to burn off her restlessness. So she walks out from her foothill house at dawn, keeps moving until nightfall. Something about walking through these open spaces seems to fit the work of matching one voice to another across the network's vastness, linking this one's needs to that one's abilities. She wears loose, flowing suits with chilling threads in the weave, and the shade and coolness her clothes create is the only thing that allows her to be out under the sun in the day. When she's close to linking a caller to an answerer, her habit is to spin. Maybe this started because the interface she uses is a wide panorama and she needs to sweep from side to side to find the person she's patching through to. It also boosts the fans and air shunts that are built into her clothes, bringing a wave of extra coolness, a little reward to herself beyond the satisfaction of making the connection. She came to the desert because the reception here is so much better than anywhere else. She times her arrival at the Underpass so that she can take a few minutes off during the most intense part of her day. Under the abandoned highway, there's no reception, which insulates her from interruption or distraction, and the respite of the all-day shade lets her open her mask. The scent of flinty sand, even if it makes her sneeze, has come to smell like rest to her. She unpacks her lunch on one of the flatter rocks. There's a cluster of squares and circles on the ground where the sun rarely reaches, marked out in hand-sized stones, only lightly covered with blown soil. She takes them for the foundations of huts from an older time and understands why this would be a good place to live. Something about the curve of the underside of the roadway funnels sound to those seeking shelter and would probably provide better early warning than any guard you could post, as long as you listened for it. She feels that, like her, the people who lived here would have been listeners. Under the underpass, she plays with hearing her own voice go out and the echoes return. As she moves around the shadowed area, she can hear the shape of the place in the timing and tone of those echoes. One noontime, several seasons ago, she heard nuances in the echoes that she hadn't heard before. A little flattening, a little longer delay. She climbed up the embankment on one side and found a little dugout area just below the roadway roof. Peering in with a handlight, she saw a small cardboard box, maybe the size for a pair of child's shoes. She slid it delicately out and lifted the lid. Wrapped in a piece of yellow felt, the body of a bird lay curled. Hardly more than bones and feathers now, but from the faded color of those feathers and the shape of the beak, a parrot. She slid it back, sad that she'd never hear its voice. After that, she felt like the underpass belonged to the parrot, and she was only its guest. Hearing the shapes of places wasn't a skill the receptionist had intended to learn, but one that she'd found growing over time. She knew when the person on the other end of the connection was sitting in a small room or a large one, with high ceilings or low, when they stood, when they reclined on a couch or bed. With time, she deduced which sounds meant metal or hard lacquered wood, learned to recognize the shallow reverb of plastic, the muffling of thick curtains, the soft blurring of open slatted blinds. She heard sounds of daily life and other conversations in adjoining rooms, people chatting in hallways and busy or quiet streets out open or closed windows. She could hear when a voice spoke, as hers did, under open sky. One lunchtime a few months later, she disturbed a snake that had been coiled in the space between two stones. It reared back to bite her, and she pulled back as well, so sharply that she tumbled backwards and tore her cooling clothes. She watched the snake zigzag hastily away and felt hot air seeping in at her back. Too jittery to talk to anyone, she needed to pass the time until the day's heat had passed and she could go home. She followed the shadows as they began stretching away from the underpass. Soon she was far enough out in the open that she could hear the satellites again, and calmed herself by finding a line that had accidentally been left open, listening deeper and deeper into it. She heard a small room, but at least 4 meters tall, probably a space subdivided out of a bigger, grander building. By the echoes, 2 walls of old plaster and 2 of new pressed fiber plastic. A low shelf along one wall, a bed along most of the opposite wall, a common enough apartment in one of the re-inhabited cities. She heard traffic and a little breeze, a window left ajar. She listened further. A construction site or a major rebuilding, a sports arena with distorted announcers' voices and occasional cheering. Behind it all, farthest off, the sea. When it was finally evening, finally cooling, she disconnected and began walking home. She was used to following her shadow in the morning and on the way back in the afternoon. But now the whole world was shadows. It reached full dark before she'd gone far, so she wound up listening as deeply as she could into the space around her, navigating by sound. She was usually talking, usually listening to distant people in faraway places, so she didn't know what the land she crossed on her daily route should sound like. And she had no idea which shapes in the star-mobbed sky might guide her. The horizon looked the same all around, no telling which of the silhouetted mountains hid her foothill home. As she walked, she remembered the sound of that empty room in that crowded city, how different it seemed from the space she moved through. Now, here, everything sounded open. Nothing echoed, no wind, only her own footsteps barely audible in the sand, slapping too loudly on a bit of old road for 7 or 8 steps. Then she was back on sand again and still lost. No matter how deeply she listened, no sign of direction. But not an empty space. She could hear the nighttime chittering and calls making their own fullness, their own life that went on most nights without her, as did all the lives she intersected in the course of a day. So much in the world, both near and far, that barely touched her. Until she heard the flick, flick, flick of a wing, a bird somewhere in the dark. She followed it. Not an elegant flyer, and easier to follow because of that. Without any rational reason to think so, she was sure it was a parrot. She kept following. In time, she could hear a difference between the foothills ahead of her and the open space beside and behind her, and soon she recognized the sound of wind in the dry stream bed that was a few hundred yards from her front door. It was familiar from the pre-dawn moment each morning just before she opened the first call of the day. She could no longer hear the bird. It must have either landed or else flown too far away. But soon she was close enough that her house chimed at her in recognition, the stepping stones of her front walk beginning to glow as the door swung open. She'd come home.
That was Rudy Dornerman reading from Underpass, a sneak peek from his notes from imaginary places. So thank you so much for that reading, Rudy.
Yeah,
I'm going to
thank
say
you.
hello to some of the people as well out in there. Thanks to Andreas, who's been boosting the event and letting us know there's some new additions on the way. And just want to say hi to all our friends and our colleagues who are here. Hi to Amelia and Eric Gougnard, who's going to be one of our guests next week. There's Charlie, Jason White from Jason's Weird Reads, Kevin and Eric. Hey everyone, thanks for being with us. Moving on to our next reader, I want to hold up this book, which is called The Dark, New Ghost Stories, or at least they were new in 2003 when The Dark came out, but 2003 is still pretty new in the tradition of ghost stories. I want to read the back, just a line from the back cover copy here from Ellen Datlow, the editor of this book and others on ghost stories. Are you afraid of the dark? That's when you can be most frightened by unrecognizable sounds, smells, touches, but occasionally a ghost comes out in the bright light of the day to exact revenge or to take care of unfinished business that was interrupted by violent death or because he or she is prevented from resting by the living. But whether taking place in the night or in the bright light of day, ghost stories touch us powerfully, precisely because they deal with death, that unknown provenance Unknown Providence, we are all born to fear. That'll teach me for reading the dark in the dark. But I was just reading the back cover copy for my own health. It raises it's just more fodder for me to make terrible jokes, which I need to stop. But it does raise the concept of the relationship. It is catchy back cover copy, but we're talking about, okay, all ghost stories just inherently in one way or another have to deal with death. And I want to say hi to Kathe, our next guest here. You have a story. The reason I was revisiting this is, while the story you're going to read from appears in your most recent collection, Velocities, the story Velocity was first published in the dark, the anthology, The Dark. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the story. How does the story deal with death and structure and haunted houses? You've got it's such a unique story, yet it has all those things that we want from a ghost story. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it.
It does have to do with death, and it does have to do with unquiet spirits. Definitely, it's a very fucked up family dynamic, and the character that we meet, who is being interviewed, comes from a family. His father is a very famous artist, and he himself is an artist, and his art has to do with the son's art recreates the moment of his father's suicide, and he keeps running bicycles into trees. His father died by an act of velocity. So their relationship was fraught, and death has not improved it, which I've never understood. This is a sidebar, but I've never understood the whole conceit of don't speak ill of the dead. If they were an asshole in life, they're still an asshole, right? You don't. And they know anyway. They know now that they were an asshole, and they, whether or not they care, we don't know. But yeah, the whole burden of this story is what does it mean to be haunted? How are we haunted? And it's told in an interview format, and I'm not going to read that part of it tonight.
Okay. So over to you, and we'll hear a bit of what you're going to read from. Over to Kathe.
Linden, aspen, maple, ash. A postcard setting, slant light and falling leaves. Gravel switchback leading to a keep-out gate. A clustering clot of outbuildings. At the heart of the property, alone in bloody maple drift, stands an incongruous house, a hard-edged, sumptuous folly that at first glance seems neglected. Dusty windows, drawn blinds, heavy bicycle chain hung across the door. The chain is old. The locks, 2 locks, are bright and new. Everywhere, broken bicycles. The house was built in the early 1970s, an austere and modern fantasia of brushed metal and glass block. It has 8 rooms, 3 of them very large. The rest are markedly, almost painfully small. All are spare, as in a monastery or zendo. Low teak tables, white futons, stainless steel appliances. All the windows have identical white paper blinds. All the walls are red. The dining table is laid with service for 9. The Red House, as it is called, is a kind of singularity, and as such, there was for a time a great demand for tours from architecture and design professionals, professors, students, historians, cultural anthropologists, as well as the lesser hordes who treasure celebrity and wealth. After the owner's spectacular and graphic suicide, the estate fell hostage to legal squabbles between his first wife and current partner. The dispute was eventually resolved in the wife's favor, but by that time she herself had died in a fire at her horse farm. The couple's only surviving relative, a son, himself an artist, came into possession of the house and immediately discontinued all public tours. It was believed that he was living on the property, but his attorney's office would not confirm that this was true. In the room that was formerly used as the laundry, the appliances have been removed and a small living space constructed, a scruffy human patch on the glass and steel. The items inside: a blue sleeping bag, worn and leaking feathers, a Coleman stove, a bed tray, a scuffed plastic washtub, all suggest an extended habitation. A shelf has been affixed 3 feet from the floor, just above the bundled sleeping bag, in easy reach of anyone lying below. On this shelf is a pink drugstore flashlight, an inhaler, an ashtray, a Remington automatic shotgun, its barrel sheared almost to the nub, and a copy of Art in America. Above the shelf is a crucifix, olive wood, immensely old. The corpse has been replaced with 2 bent roofing nails. As per the trust, the Red House and its grounds are serviced on a seasonal schedule: mowing, raking, bundling brush, blowing snow, repairing the depredations of weather. There's a lavish budget set aside for these things, and they are always faithfully performed. The former laundry room is rigorously avoided unless there is actual damage within it that needs repair. When the lawn crews arrive, the broken and discarded bicycles are carefully removed to the garage. Before the crews leave, the parts are restored to their earlier approximate positions. This is not part of the trust's directions, but there is a sizable rider in the maintenance contract to ensure that these things are done. Money, as always, is neutral and efficient in its demands. Because of the way the Red House is constructed, because of its placement on the grounds and the arrangement of trees and shrubs, it owns a peculiar radiance in the early evening sun, a deep and affecting glow, as if the house were lit from within. Visitors are not always aware of this phenomenon and are sometimes confused by the house's name, the Red House, seeing only its gunmetal gray and glass exterior. But if one arrives at almanac sundown, the house will indeed be glowing, as hot and red and chambered as a beating heart.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for that reading. That's one of the sections. They're framed. There are several sections when you pick up a copy of Velocities to check it out. There's, as Kathe said, there's an interview, and it's punctuated by these the bits of narration about the house, which I love. I love how you depict the haunting as from the rider, the maintenance rider in the trust. You know, it's like it's just so subtle. It's like there's a rider that very specifically, but it's there. Items need to be put back into their spots, you know. And in some of the other places you talk about the laundry room, even though it's been remodeled. People just know not to go in there. So you've done a unique and effective job of giving us a haunted house there.
And the haunting of the house is pretty much in all haunted dwellings or areas, comes from, you know, in this case, the fucked up father is the one who caused the place to be constructed, but it's that animating spirit of, you know, what's even the point of this house glowing red? Why would you? And the rest of the story is told in an interview format between an arts journalist and the son, whose attempts to exorcise his father from that house, and, you know, by extension from his life, are growing more and more and more crazy and desperate as he keeps running bicycles into trees over and over and over and over again. And that energy is clearly still present, and why he chooses to be in that house and to recreate the suicide is where the energy comes from.
Yeah, and like, you know, like the best of stories or the best of speculative stories, they're human stories. They're stories about what families and what people go through. I want to mention a story that it's one that you brought up to me in our preparations, but just noting for us and for everyone out there that we didn't have a chance to revisit this story, but we just wanted to touch on it because it was noteworthy. This was a book you brought to my attention was I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right. Was it the Maurice Mayer collection?
Maurice Meyer.
Maurice
Yeah.
Meyer. Okay, and this was it was a book that she pointed out to me called Story. It's a book of stories called Heartbreaker. I didn't have a chance to read them yet, but it's ringing to me now. It's resonating with Kathe's story because I was looking at some reviews, looking at some commentary about it, and it's sort of the opposite of what you said jokingly in the introduction to Velocity of like asshole in life, asshole in death. But what caught my eye in one of the reviews from the Meyer book was this is a story called Whole Life Ahead. And the little blurb for it was, in this short story, the ghost in the story just wants to be left alone. And we have a delusional guy who is insistent on making the ghost his girlfriend, right? And so it's just sort of the opposite of it. It's something that is way too familiar, but it's being played out in the that's why I want to read this story, but it's just sort of the opposite. It's like the asshole in life is still the asshole in life who is not letting the ghost rest. So I just wanted to mention that if you recall the story, you could let me know what you think of it. Or
Oh, I love that story. I love that story, and I love to read that story aloud as a representation of this, and why I happen to have it right here on my desk. Everyone should immediately read everything that Maurice does. I think Maurice is one of her voice is so fierce and so just original. I love what she does, and what she does in Whole Life Ahead. This is one of the most savage stories that you will ever read, and it's so deceptively calm and so deceptively gentle. And it's absolutely true that this man is persecuting the shit out of this ghost, and he will not let her be. He will not let her be who she is, which is a dead girl. She is dead, and has come to grips with that, and he absolutely will not stop. And it's a parable for a lot of things and a lot of relationships. But yeah, he is the live guy is definitely the asshole. And this ghost woman finally escapes into the ladies' room at this restaurant he's insisted she visit. And when she doesn't come back after a quarter hour, he goes to look for her, his knuckles sorry on the door. Hey, you okay? He calls. No answer. He knocks again. Please, I didn't mean it. Just come out. When he opens the door, there is no one inside, just a circle of graveyard dirt in the wet sink.
oh damn,
Yeah, she's the real thing. I love everything she does.
oh wow, oh I'm glad you had that on hand. That's like awesome. That is what the curse and the blessing of doing these things. It's just all the books I have to read. I have no choice. I have to read them. That's great. Speaking of must reads, another one of your favorites that you mentioned was a Daphne D. Monnier piece back from the 70s. Don't look now.
Don't look now.
Don't look now. So, and I also learned that there's a film. I think.
Oh yeah.
Sutherland film of the same name, which I was reading about it. I remembered seeing it and not realizing it was based on a story. But you're going to read from it. Can you give us a setup as to why this one too is one of your favorites?
This is another really great examination of dread, and Daphne du Maurier, in fact, had more than one of her works adapted for film. She's also the writer behind The Birds, the Alfred Hitchcock film, which I guess she just fucking hated his version of it. But she loved the film version of this story, Don't Look Now. And the setup is a couple, a man and woman, are in Venice after the death of one of their children, and they're trying to restart their lives partially because of this vacation. And the wife does not seem to be able to let go of the dead child the way that he has. And now they're out laughing to go out for dinner into the warm, soft night. There were other couples strolling for the same sake of aimless enjoyment, backwards, forwards, purposeless. And the trouble is, said Laura, walking in Venice becomes compulsive once you start. Just over the next bridge, you say, and then the next one beckons. I'm sure there are no restaurants down here. We're almost at those public gardens. Let's turn back. Tell you what, said John, if we go down here by the arsenal, cross that bridge, we'll come upon San Zaccaria from the other side. We did it the other morning. Yes, but it was daylight then. We may lose our way. It's not very well lit. I have an instinct for these things. Don't fuss. They turned down and crossed the little bridge short of the arsenal itself and past the church. There were 2 canals ahead, one right, the other left, with narrow streets beside them. You see, protested Laura, we shall be lost, just as I said. Nonsense, replied John. It's the left-hand one. I remember the little bridge. The canal was narrow. The houses on either side seemed to close in upon it. And in the daytime, with the sun's reflection on the water and the windows of the houses open, bedding upon the balconies, a canary singing, there was an impression of warmth, of secluded shelter. Now, ill-lit, almost in darkness, the windows of the houses shuttered, the water dank. The scene appeared altogether different, neglected, poor, and the long, narrow boats moored to the slippery steps of cellar entrances looked like coffins. I swear I don't remember this bridge, said Laura, and I don't like the look of that alleyway. There's a lamp halfway up, John told her. I know exactly where we are. They crossed the bridge and were about to plunge into the alleyway when they heard the cry. It came surely from one of the houses on the opposite side, but which one it was impossible to say. They turned and stared in the direction from which the cry had come. What was that? Whispered Laura. Some drunk or other, John said. Let's go. But less like a drunk than someone being strangled. The choking cry suppressed as the grip held firm. And we ought to call the police, said Laura. Oh, for heaven's sake, said John. Well, it's sinister. And she began to hurry away up the twisting alley. John hesitated, his eye caught by a small figure which suddenly crept from a cellar entrance below one of the opposite houses and then jumped into a narrow boat. It was a child, a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, wearing a short coat, a pixie hood covering her head. There were 4 boats moored line upon line, and she proceeded to jump from one to the other with surprising agility, intent upon escape. Once her foot slipped, and he caught his breath. Then she recovered and hopped onto the furthest boat. Bending, she tugged the rope and swung the boat's after end across the canal, almost touching the opposite side and another cellar entrance. Then the child jumped again, landing upon the steps and vanished into the house, the boat swinging back behind her. The whole episode could not have taken more than a few minutes. Then he heard the quick patter of feet, Laura returning. She had seen none of it, for which he felt unspeakably thankful. The sight of a child, a little girl, in what must have been danger, her fear that the scene he had just witnessed was in some way a sequel, might have had a disastrous effect on her already overwrought nerves. And that child does, in fact, have many effects in this story. But she sets it up so beautifully and so masterfully, and so much of the city itself feels like a character and is so present in the story. It's as if it could take place nowhere else.
Well said. I love stories that do that. And looking forward to revisiting that one. I did recently pick up a copy of, it was an edition of, I think they called it The Birds and Other Stories. But yeah, it was promoting that, but just hearing that makes me want to revisit it even more.
It's really good.
Andreas Lastet, he picked up a copy of some of the Meyer stuff on your recommendation last time.
Good.
So well done. We're just a bit over the hour mark, so let's take a quick 5-minute break. We'll step away from the camera. We'll be back in 5 minutes for more ghost stories, more discussion. We'll talk about some ghost story films, and we'll be talking with Brian in just a minute or two. So stick around, stay tuned. We'll be right back. While we're waiting for everyone to come back, if you're with us, I'll get my headphones on relatively straight. We'll mention we're in the intermission. It's just a 5-minute intermission. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. Daniel Braum, it's the channel you're watching on. If you want to support the show, you could donate via the Ko-Fi site, which is ko-fi.com/nighttime logic. You can donate that way, or any of the normal ways that you do it. Looks like Brian's back, or he's on his way back. Tune in. Our next night is coming up. It's coming up Tuesday night, and we've got a bunch of guests that we're going to be talking with. I'm going to pose the question. This is something I picked up. This is the 5th Fontana book of great ghost stories. And to everyone, our guests who are coming back, I'm just talking for a couple of minutes in our intermission while everyone takes their seats again, giving a little sneak peek of what's going to happen on night 3, in addition to talking with our guests. I just realized, so The Swords is one of my favorite Robert Aickman ghost story. And I always puzzle over that story in all the right ways. And one of the things I never thought about The Swords was, is The Swords a ghost story? And then I found that it was printed for the first time in, I believe, 1969 in Aickman's own series, his anthology, The Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories. So Aickman is someone who doesn't speak much, if at all, about his own work, but he mentions that he has included The Swords in his book of great ghost stories, and I'm like, wait a minute, this changes everything. I mean, it doesn't change how great the story is. It doesn't change my experience with it. But I'm like, wow, one of the few things the man himself says is that I must, he's sort of like explaining why he put his own story in a book of great ghost stories. And, and he's like, I think he goes to say, yes, I didn't put a story in book 4 and there was some outcry. So I've given you a great ghost story, for book 5. So I'm like, wait a minute, examining The Swords as a ghost story, it demands a reread and it demands discussion. That's our little sneak peek of, I'll be posing that to our night 3 guests, but we're still here at night 2 and we're just coming back from the intermission. So before we get started, I just want to say, thanks for coming. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't, and you can donate at ko-fi.com, Nighttime Logic. And I'll just mention everyone's work here before we get started. My most recent book is Underworld Dreams. It's got a pair of ghost stories in it, Between Our Earth and Their Moon and Red Yetzi's Shadow. 2 very different kinds of ghost stories. The books, please support our guests tonight. Dark Factory is Kathe Koja's new immersive fiction project, and you can find that at darkfactory.club, and it was written to be read online and on the page, with a print edition coming in May 2022 from Meerkat Press. Check out Brian Evanson's latest collection, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which is out now. And visit Rudy Dornerman's website for everything about his fiction, and most importantly, where you can connect with the tales from his latest project, Notes from Imaginary Places. So I have some questions now for Brian. Before we talk about your stories, let's mention our ghost emeritus of the evening. Jeff Ford couldn't be with us tonight, but we're all a fan of Jeff. We're a fan of Jeff's work. Yep, you can connect. So this is a story that Jeff read in person at one of the last events that I put on at one of the last nighttime logic events at the KGV bar before the pandemic. And he did read this story, which is called The Jeweled Wren. He read it in full there. I believe that's over on the Ink Heist podcast. So you can hear that. So we're back. I'm going to turn that off. We're back. You can hear that on the Ink Heist podcast. But I wanted to ask you, Brian, tell us about The Jeweled Wren and why it's one of the standout ghost stories that you mentioned when talking about ghost stories.
You know, when I think of ghost stories and kind of contemporary ghost stories, I often think of Jeff's work just because he works in that space a lot and works in it in a way that's surprising. The thing I love about that story is that there's a character who's very much like Jeff, almost seems to be a kind of version of Jeff. And it's very simple the way it's done, you know, kind of just takes place in this house where it seems like something is just playing on repeat over and over again. And I just think it's just very delicately done, and then gets to a very poignant place by the end of the story too, kind of projecting past it. So those are all the things I like about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's not even just the ghost story aspect of the work, but in any discussion of Jeff's work, you just have to mention that voice. And you know, I've been reading and hearing Jeff for about 20 years now, and right there's a simple defiance of expectations. And we talk about, we defied expectations. Maybe you think, it's like that water cooler moment, or it's something flashy, but Jeff's work is so unsettling to me because when I first heard him read, I think he was reading a story the night at the tropics, and the voice was so convincing. I was with Gavin Grant, and I'm like, is this a story? Like, is he telling us about this? Is this a story?
Yeah.
And especially the first time, or for me the first time, what's so unsettling about his work is he's completely got you. He's got you in there by the voice. You've suspended disbelief because of the voice, and that is something easier said than done, and so important in fiction. But
yeah, he's a great stylist. I mean, that's a big part of it. He's very, very good at putting it together in a way that feels convincing.
Yeah, it's just amazing how he does that. Let's talk about your work. I have a quote. I was looking up some past interviews with you. I wanted to read this quote. You did an interview with someone named William Hoffacker about your story called Lost Dog, and I just want to read the question and the answer in case you don't have the 2014 interview on the tip of your tongue there. The interviewer asked you, the story opens with a man living in a kind of stasis after the death of his wife. Why focus the narrative on the aftermath of loss rather than the tragic event itself? And so I just wanted to read to everyone your answer, even though if the story isn't an on-the-nose ghost story. You said to that, I'm often more interested in the moment that precedes a disaster or the ruins existing after it than on the tragic event itself. A lot of my stories either truncate at the moment of tension, just on the verge of something huge actually happening, or start after something's occurred or after it's already too late. We all go through tragedy. That's the nature of being human. A lot more is revealed about someone's nature by how they get to the point of tension or collapse, how they resist it or guide it forward, and by how they pick up the pieces afterwards. And I didn't want this to be a story about a man losing his wife, but about different kinds of loss. I like the idea of being haunted, but not by the thing you want to be haunted by. So my question for you is, you've written lots of stories with this notion of being haunted, and not by the thing you want to be haunted by. So how does that notion fit in with what a ghost story means to you?
Well, when I think of it, it's I feel like when actually that story kind of started because I had an ex-girlfriend who had a boyfriend who committed suicide, and she kept on talking about how um, she kept expecting him to come back and visit her and talk to her, and it never happened. But that she kept on having these other kind of uncanny moments that had nothing to do with that or nothing really to do with their life. And she felt like, it was just so strange to feel like there was something kind of supernatural out there, but that the thing that should be haunting you, or that should be the kind of most dramatic thing, is just not there at all. So I think it's partly that. I mean, I think sometimes, especially when we go through loss, we want to be haunted by the thing, certain kinds of things. And I was really interested just in that as a notion. And this story, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the jeweled wren before, because I feel like my story, Lost Dog, has this kind of similar cyclical structure to it, where there's something that keeps on recurring at a certain time, which is what happens in Jeff's story. And I hadn't actually put that together until you mentioned it. And that's what I like about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just talking to someone last night about different kinds of ghosts, and I'm not up on my ghost lingo, but I think one of them is called a recursion. I guess, that's the ghost lingo. There's a ghost where it's not a sentient haunting. It's just this sort of recursion. And we started the festival off with a story by Kevin Brockmeyer. I read one from his The Ghost Variations, where it was a take on a recursion, a cycle, like you mentioned right there. And yeah, I like what you said about we expect something, or we expect to be haunted by loss, or that's something. It's part of the way we deal with loss. On the first night of the conference, we were talking with John Paget, and he was talking about another one of he had a haunted house of sorts stories, and he had mentioned that this was the dreams, and the dream of this house was part of how he was dealing with a really fresh loss of a member of his family, his grandmother. And it was chilling to me because I lost my grandmother, and it was really a really big event in my life as well. And I too was dreaming about the house, and someone chimed in the comments that it was just this moment of like, it was something I wasn't brave enough to write about or brave enough to talk about. But then I just realized from hearing, John saying, yeah, this is how I was processing loss and how I dealt with it in someone else. Yeah. It's like, these are ways that we process loss, and that ties right back into the ghost stories, a way of processing loss.
Yeah, I just read Rodrigo Garcia's book, which is about the death of his father, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and so much of that book is just about the house and the layout of the house and where the body was, but also just the way the house was. And there's something about the persistence of place in the face of the loss of the person who lived there that really ends up, I think, haunting us. My mom's an architect too, so I constantly have these dreams about houses and spaces, and I'm sure Freud would have a lot to say about that.
I wonder that's a great turn of phrase, though, the persistence of place. I mean, that in the face of loss. And I have people who deal with architecture in my family. I wonder if it's not Freud. Maybe it's something Freudian, maybe it's not at all. I mean, I have recurring dreams of familiar places, but of extra spaces. Like, I'm constantly discovering places in these houses that are definitely not there, and it's a recurring dream. And I don't know, maybe I'm giving away. I'm reluctant to talk about it on Facebook to give the algorithm too much truth about me. I'm not sure if YouTube is going to create the AI version of the ads are going to be extra dimensional now. There's another great, if you haven't read Audrey's Door by Sarah Langan, it's just a fantastic novel by any standard, and it's a fantastic architectural story and a ghost story that I highly recommend that as well. your story, His Hauntings, appears in Echoes, another Ellen Datlow book. You're going to read from it. Can you just tell us a bit about His Hauntings and set up the reading?
Yeah, I mean, His Haunting is about someone who's had a kind of experience with haunting that's occurred over various moments of his life with big spaces in between. And he is talking about this experience with the therapist and trying to figure it out. And the therapist thinks he's trying to figure out one thing, and perhaps he's trying to figure out something slightly different.
All right, over to Brian. Over to
Thank
Brian.
you. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of this. His
great.
Haunting. 3 times in his life, someone or something unknown had opened Arn's door as he tried to sleep, silently sliding it ajar and then standing immobile in the gap. That was all, just standing there, unmoving, just barely visible in the darkness. It wasn't even all that threatening, he told his therapist. Not really. What had disturbed him most about it was not knowing who or what it was. In the darkness, he could make nothing out beyond the door's frame and the silhouette of the figure enclosed within. A large figure, male almost certainly, hulking, head nearly scraping the lintel. Who is it? He had asked that first time, sitting up in bed. How long the figure was there, he wasn't sure. It felt at once like a very long time and no time at all. The figure didn't answer. Nothing about it made Arn believe it had heard him. But as soon as he threw his blanket off, the door began to creak shut, the latch sinking into the slot just before he reached it. By the time he fumbled the door open and peered out, the hall outside was deserted. That first time, he hurried through the small house, searching for it. He turned on the lights and looked into the other rooms, peered into closets and cabinets. No one was there. He felt he should be frightened, and part of him was, but another part was surprisingly calm and unafraid, as if already dead. Hoping not to have to wake her, he saved his aunt's bedroom for last. But finally, having looked without success everywhere else, he knocked softly on her door. When she didn't answer, he opened it. It was very dark inside. He could not see her, could only hear her thickened breathing. "Aunt," he whispered. There was no answer. "Aunt, is it just you in there?" he whispered. The breathing sputtered, ceased. He heard something move in the bed. He thought he could vaguely make out motion in the darkness, though perhaps this was his imagination. And for an instant he felt torn in two, as if he were both the person just waking up in bed watching and the figure framed in the doorway. For hadn't he just been the one and now was the other? Only when his aunt shrieked did he begin to feel like just one person again. I'll stop there. You're muted, Dan.
It's not a festival. It's not an event if I don't talk while I'm muted. So thank you for the help, Brian, and thank you so much for that reading from His Hauntings. Now that appears in Echoes. Is that reprinted in one of your books yet, or is that?
It is in Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. So yeah.
Okay, great.
There.
So you could get that in. You could read the rest of that in the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, or in Echoes by Ellen Datlow. No Ghost Story Festival is going to be complete without me being on mute, and of course without mention of M.R. James and a story that you mentioned to me. It's called The Game of Bear, which was a ghost story in progress from M.R. James, and it was completed by the author Reggie Oliver. Can you tell us a bit about how did that come about, if you know, of Oliver completing the story? Do you even know that?
I think he, I don't know for sure, but I think it was just a story that has been long kind of left uncompleted. About half the story is there, and I think just Oliver picked it up. It appears in a volume of his stories from Tartarus Press. Tartarus, one of the reasons I chose him is because I feel like Tartarus is doing just amazing things with ghost stories. Publishing lots of great stuff. But yeah, it's in a
they
book
publish. What's the name of it?
Oh, it's in a book called The Ballet of Dr. Caligari and Matter Mysteries.
Yeah, Tartarus does great stuff. I just got my first, not my first, because I have an Angela Slatter Tartarus edition, and I just picked up one of the one of the Aikman ones that reprints, like these Aikman paperbacks are hard to find, and in one they reprinted his introductions, and in my search for clues for meaning about Aikman, but Tartarus is great. So the Game of Bear, why how does it fit into the M.R. James stories for you? What's the setup for the bit you're going to read?
Well, it kind of circles back to what we were talking about earlier, which is, just the notion of new versus old with ghost stories, and how you both want certain things that you think of as being very ghost story-esque, and then maybe want something as well that kind of surprises and shifts you. And Reggie Oliver, I think, is one of the best kind of writers of ghost stories I know, who's able to kind of enter into that kind of classical mindset and kind of participate it in a way that really works, and still kind of gives excites me in the way that someone like James does often. I always teach A Whistle I'll Come to You when I do my ghost story class, and that's just a story that endlessly works for me. And the students have this experience with it where the premise, when you look at it, is very odd with that story, but it's a remarkable story, and remarkable how much he does with so little with that. So
yeah, we talked about that one and its connection to the Specialist's Hat last year with Jeff in great detail. But before you jump into reading the M.R. James, do you have, for a beginner like me, what would you recommend? Can you recommend to me some Reggie Oliver to start with?
Yeah, I mean, everything is pretty good. There's my favorite story of his is a story called The Flowers of the Sea, or Flowers of the Sea. Sorry, I don't know that. Which is, I don't know if it's a ghost story or not. A lot of ghost stories I like, I'm not sure if they're ghost stories. If that makes sense.
I'm even more hooked and more excited when you say something like that.
It has a very strange moment in it, which I think is very compelling. But generally speaking, he has a lot of stories which are about the theater. Black Shuck Books did a little book of his, which is small stories about the theater, which is very affordable and a great place to start. But everything I've read by his, I think, is interesting. So
thank you for those recommendations. Flowers of the Sea sounds fantastic. So let's turn it over to Brian again, who's going to be reading from the Game of Bear by M.R. James, completed by Reggie Oliver.
So I'm going to start by reading just a little bit from the very beginning, which is what James wrote. He wrote a lot more of this, but then I'm going to skip forward. Two elderly persons sat reading and smoking in the library of a country house after tea on an afternoon in the Christmas holidays. And outside, a number of the children of the house were playing about. They had turned out all the lights and were engaged in the dreadful game of bear, which entails stealthy creepings up and down staircases and along passages, and being leapt upon from doorways with loud and hideous cries. Such a cry and an answering scream of great poignancy were heard just outside the library door. One of the two readers, an uncle of the young things who were disporting themselves there, leapt from his chair and dashed the door open. "I will not have you doing that," he shouted, and his voice was vibrant with real anger. "Do you hear? Stop it at once. I can't stand it." It goes on. I'm going to skip a bunch of pages, but in the middle it kind of talks about, he tells a story of a friend of his, and who inherited a house, someone named Henry, and his cousin, Carolyn Perdue, who wants the house, and everything she does to kind of unsettle him. And I'm going to jump quite a bit forward, and now we're in Reggie Oliver's kind of continuation of the story. 25th of January. The chill, no doubt exacerbated by CP's stubborn refusal of any assistance from myself and others, has finally done for her. A pulmonary infection had set in, and the rector found her dead in her bed when he paid a call on her this morning. Naturally, I will see to all the proper funerary arrangements. God forgive me if I feel more than a little relieved that this dreadful incubus has now departed for good. In Perdue's diary, again, the date 4th of February are the words CP funeral, St. Jude's. These words have been heavily underlined 3 times in black ink. We now return again to the papers. 3rd March. Most unexpectedly, and very much to my annoyance, Hardacre informs me that my wretched cousin, C.P., has left me something in her will. It is only a parcel of books, but still it is a nuisance. Perhaps she has heard tell of my bookish taste, for I made no secret of them. Doubtless they are all so much valueless trash and barely worth sending to the church jumble sale. Friday. The parcel of books that C.P. left me has arrived, and, as I expected, there is little of value or interest. There are some religious tracts, a large old family Bible, which I suppose I must keep, and several volumes of 18th century sermons of the dullest possible kind. Not even a Sherlock, let alone a Sterne, among them. There is perhaps one item of interest. It is a small volume, quarter octavo, entitled The Child's Keepsake, Improving Rhymes Composed Expressly for Young Persons by a Lady. There is no date, but from the style of printing and the crude woodcuts which adorn the text, I would guess it to be very late 18th or early 19th century. And I have no doubt that the lady in question was some member of an evangelical sect, an enthusiast at any rate, perhaps one of Hannah More's circle. My bibliophilic tastes do not extend to early literature for children, but I can recognize a rarity when I see one. The condition is excellent, too, with the original boards, bound no doubt by a provincial bookseller, but a competent one. The text is addressed to the young and consists of tales told in verse of an improving and moral character. At the head of each poem is a rectangular woodcut depicting an incident from the story. Here is a fair example. Its title is Reverence for the Aged Advised, and it begins, "Mock not the old in youth, young friend, lest you should meet a bitter end." It then goes on to tell the biblical story from Kings, 2 Kings 2, verses 23-24, about the children who derided Elisha for his baldness. He put a curse on his tormentors, whereupon 2 she-bears came out of the woods to destroy them. The cut which accompanies this rhyme depicts the offending children being torn to pieces in a most savage manner. One of the she-bears has a small child's head clamped between its merciless jaws. I was not very favorably struck. That biblical tale has always exemplified for me the savagery, dare I say it, the inhumanity of the Old Testament, and it seems to me a cruel legend to tell to a child. Perhaps I am something of a sentimentalist in these matters, not having any children of my own. Most of the verses are of the same punitive character, dwelling more on sin and retribution than virtue and reward. One in particular impresses me with its horrid severity. It is entitled, "The Dreadful Fate of Young Master Henry, who Stole an Apple from an Old Woman." My name happens to be Henry. In it, a young boy steals an apple from a poor old woman and runs away home. Once there, he secretes himself in a cupboard under the stairs in order to devour the purloined fruit in peace. He hears his mother calling for him, but he does not dare come out until he has finished eating. When he does, he encounters a woman whom he takes to be his mother, but she has a veil over her face. And when he drew aside the veil, the wicked child let out a wail, transported by a sudden fear, for it was not his mother dear. The face he met was quite unknown, a pale and hollow mask of bone, for death itself had found him there, in cupboard dark beneath the stair. I cannot say much for the lady's versifying abilities, but I must reluctantly admit that I found the tale rather hard to put out of my mind, added to which the accompanying woodcut is quite dreadful. If I were not so absurdly reverential of all books, I would have torn it out on the spot, lest some young friend of mine accidentally encountered it. It depicts, crudely of course, but with considerable vividness, a dark corridor with a staircase going up on the right-hand side. You can just see the door of the cupboard under the stairs lying open and a slice of blackness within. In the corridor stands a strikingly disagreeable female figure. She is thin and wears the high-waisted gown of a woman of Jane Austen's period. The head is covered by what appears to be a dark muslin veil through which the engraver's cunning has allowed the more horrible features of her face to be seen. There is a hollow-eyed skull with just a few rags of skin clinging to the cheeks and a gaping mouth full of horridly sharp teeth. Although common sense dictates that the eye sockets must be empty, the viewer forms the distinct impression that he is being watched by the ghastly figure on the page.
Excellent reading. I'm
Thank you.
unmuting. Trying to unmute Rudy and Kathe. You can unmute yourselves when you get a chance. But thank you for that reading, Brian. Yeah, it was great. How it seemed like Reggie Oliver really did. He did a great job of capturing the language and sort of the rhythm of M.R. James. There, it did a great job.
Yeah, I've never met him, but I kind of always expect him to be 170 years old.
to be a ghost of death's visage.
And that same animosity towards the young that you see in so many of the James stories, like the famous Magic Lantern episode, right, where there's so much cruelty to children. It's really bracing to read.
That's one of the wonderful and terrifying things about his work.
It evokes Krampus for Christmas time with the two she-bears with the naughty child. I'm like, I already sent out my Krampus Christmas cards this year, but I have ideas for next year now. We're getting near the end of the program, but if we have stick around just for a couple of minutes, just throw a question or just an anything goes over to the panel. Ghost stories on film. You mentioned His House. I just watched for the first time, unbelievably, I believe it's 1963. The Haunting. I had never seen it before, so I just checked that one out, which was great fun on a bunch of levels. Any ghost stories on film that you just love or on your radar or that you want to see?
Personal Shopper. Is my favorite modern ghost film. I love that movie. And it's just what we have been saying. It goes nowhere that you expect. And the only thing I don't understand to this day is the title. It can be so off-putting to people. And yes, she is a personal shopper, but no, that really doesn't matter that much. Her task could have been anything. I think it's done so well and so unsentimentally. But Brian, it goes back to what you were saying about wanting and expecting to be haunted and leaving herself as open to it as she can. And brilliant ghost story. Love that movie.
Yeah.
I wonder if, like that's both frustrating or I think Rudy said the sneakiness of some of the ghosts. Like if that's just the way of keeping us off guard. Like, yeah, for a while I didn't see Personal Shopper when it first came out because I was thrown by the title. I was like, oh yeah, maybe I'm not into it. But like, is there something to going into a movie? Right, like often I'll see a movie, it's a drama or a comedy. I'm like, this will be better with a vampire, or this will be better with a ghost. All too many times. Right, like, are we expecting a certain kind of movie and it just fearlessly moves into the supernatural? Maybe it was intentionally that way. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other great ones on people's radar or favorites?
I can mention some weird ones I really like. I love the Japanese movie House. If you do know that.
Oh yeah.
Which is it was composed it was written by the filmmaker and his 14-year-old daughter, and so she just has all these very weird suggestions that he just went along with.
Oh, cool.
And it's crazy, but it's also really, really fun. So.
And that's from the 80s, right? It was like the early 80s.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. It says an early one.
That's a classic, and it's an unusual one.
Mm-hmm.
Rudy, any ghost stories on your radar or any favorites?
Not necessarily a favorite. One thing that came to mind in terms of, throw a vampire in anything, and also thinking to the Chinese and Japanese stuff we've been talking about, kind of in pandemic time, a number of the streaming services have been really pushing a lot of K-dramas. So we started watching a few of those, not necessarily horror, but full of ghosts and people who are expiating, their past lives. And some of them will just switch gears in mid-episode, and suddenly they open the Forbidden Room, and you've popped into a horror show instead, because there's something really terrible and creepy coming at you and unstoppable. And then you're back to a rom-com by the end of the episode. But
That's
it just
great.
feels like what little I've seen. There's a big ocean out there of integrated ghosts in things beyond where you'd expect to find them.
Another one that comes to mind is just kind of, you made me think, Rudy. The Wailing, if you've seen The Wailing, which is a kind of amazing movie that South Korean movie that has gets to really strange places, but also is very comic sometimes, and it's the movement back and forth can be really, really amazing.
Yeah. The juxtaposition of the real different ends of the spectrum of emotion, and maybe in foreign films that's more common than perhaps in the U.S. I don't know there.
Well, I think it maybe goes back to what we were talking about before, and what Kathe, or maybe I think you said, Kathe, just the idea that we do tend to kind of compartmentalize our ghosts, or kind of put them off to the side. And if you're in a culture that doesn't do that, then they do just become kind of part of everything. So,
which is why I've always been bummed out that Wuthering Heights is not considered first and foremost a ghost story, because everybody in that story is completely matter of fact about even the outsider who's brought in to experience all the hijinks. At the end, this little kid is saying, "There's Heathcliff and a woman on the path, and I can't pass them," and no one's like, "You poor child." They're like, "Oh shit, there's ghosts. Don't go there." I mean, everyone takes it completely seriously, and I love that story could not work any other way. You can't have someone stroking their chin and going, "Well, it's like they're all real, and you're in trouble. Get off the path."
Yeah, I love that.
It's like the cop that Rudy mentioned in the story. So you're haunted by these ghosts.
Right. Right. No one tries to talk you out of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great notion to end up on. That notion that is set the ghosts free. Set them.
Ghosts are real.
Ghosts
are real. Don't act like they're not.
Tear down the walls. Tear down the boundaries. They're just like you and me. They just want to cross over from one world to the next. No, but at least for we writers, and I'll take it. In the worlds of story, let's let the ghosts bleed in everywhere. But thank you to this great panel. My film list and my to read list, as always, grows larger. It was fantastic hearing all your thoughts about ghosts and hearing from everyone's work. So please pick up the ghost stories from our panelists tonight. Thank you so much for coming. If I'm going to run the closing credits, if our guests will stick around for a second, and have a great night to everyone in our comments, and hopefully we will see you on Tuesday.